You know, Mr. Speaker, when I was a kid, my dad had a favorite joke he used to like to tell us. This is one of a couple jokes that he told us that he had learned growing up in Trinidad. This is a joke called Wisdom Pie. So the way it goes is there was a man who didn't have much. He lived on the streets. He was forced to use his wits to survive. So one day he had an idea. He managed to scrape together enough coins, begged, found, to get a little bit of butter, flour, and an egg. Whipped up a sort of pie crust. He filled that pie crust with a substance that was in, shall we say, copious supply in a nearby cow pasture. He mixed it in with a little bit of cocoa that he found and covered it with a bit of cane sugar, and he baked it over an open fire. And he took that pie and he went out and knocked on a door in the community. And when the homeowner came to answer, the man declared, "Hey, this is your lucky day, sir. You have a chance to be the first to try my special recipe, Wisdom Pie." The homeowner said, "Well, Wisdom Pie, well, what's that?" The poor man said, "Well, it's the most wonderful thing. You know, it's a magical pie. It's made from the freshest natural ingredients. It's guaranteed to give you a tremendous burst of energy, to raise your awareness and give you a long memory, and all this from a single bite." Well, the homeowner was impressed. He thought it sounded like a wonderful thing, so he haggled with the seller for a few minutes before they settled on a price for the pie, and the seller quickly hurried off with his money. Homeowner went inside to sample this amazing purchase. He cut a slice and he took a bite. As soon as he tasted what was in that pie, he instantly sat up and ran out the door to chase that seller down. And he found the seller a few streets over, and he started giving him a pretty good chewing out, saying, you know, he'd been cruelly tricked. And the seller said, no, not at all. You see, clearly one bite of that pie gave you a tremendous burst of energy that allowed you to run here so quickly. You're clearly far more aware than you were before, and I'm sure this is a memory that will last the rest of your life. Mr. Speaker, what we have before us in Bill 1 is a heaping serving of wisdom pie. And the fact is, yes, the bill has been amended, but you know what? No amount of cinnamon and spice and extra sugar changes what is at the heart of this bill. It does not change what is at the heart of that wisdom pie. You know, I think back, Mr. Chair, think back to this spring when I had the honor of introducing a private member's bill. And I remember at that time being told my bill was not worthy of debate. Being told that I had not consulted enough. In particular, I had not consulted enough with racialized communities, including indigenous communities. I remember being told by one of the ministers, indeed, the minister of what is essentially now Labor, and his comments were, "Mr. Speaker, a bill of this nature requires a great deal of consultation, not just from the activist class or from the academic class, but from a wide range of cultural communities." The minister went on to say, rather than taking into consultation different communities, they proposed an unwieldy bill that would make it harder for government departments to function. A political football, he called it, Mr. Speaker, and said on that side of the aisle they were not interested in party and foolish politics. That minister, Mr. Chair, has been one of the chief people stumping for this hot mess of a job-killing bill. An embarrassment of an act that did not see a single bit of consultation with indigenous communities who are owed the duty to consult under treaty rights. This minister stands in favor of that. Mr. Speaker, if my bill was not worthy of debate, then this bill was not even worthy of ever being introduced. Far more thought and care went into that bill than has been spent in any of this bill that we have sent here. This bill is an embarrassment. It is going to be incredibly damaging to our economy. And the government should be ashamed of ever having brought it into this House. You know, we've been down this road before. Now, the bill is being amended, and the amendment is removing sweeping powers that this government chose to award to itself. Now, the minister, of course, tried to deny this multiple times on social media, but the fact is, they are now essentially admitting it is true because they are amending to take it out. Now, of course, just goes to show how little thought the government put into this bill, and that they failed to recognize the incredibly sweeping powers they were giving to themselves and are now amending out of existence, or they intended to do so and just got caught. You know, I think back, Mr. Speaker, this is a government that it's very fond of awarding itself extraordinary powers. We have another bill in front of this House right now, Bill 4, in which this government is taking back a power that they said, well, when they brought the bill in, Bill 21, they said, well, we're just clarifying a power that we always feel we had. This being a government, Mr. Speaker, that is pretty presumptive. Arrogant, entitled, I think those are appropriate words. Think back to Bill 10, Mr. Speaker. I remember the debate on Bill 10, where they expanded the powers that they had that were similar to this under the Public Health Act, going even beyond what they've tried to award themselves here in Bill 1, going so far as to allow themselves to create entirely new legislation without ever setting foot in the legislature. Now, at least then, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, that was within the context of a public health emergency. So at least there was some boundaries on it there. As embarrassing as that was, and as much as they, in the end, then had to go and walk that entire thing back, strike an entire legislative committee, spend weeks with multiple MLAs to undo that bit of arrogance that they refused to listen to when we were debating it here in the chamber, and we told them exactly what they were doing. But it blew back on them from their own supporters. Now, what we have in front of us now, we have clearly seen over the last week, is receiving incredible blowback from many in the community, to the point that we are now here debating this amendment to the bill today, an amendment which certainly removes a problematic portion of the bill, but ultimately, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, this bill at its core is wisdom pie. There is nothing to redeem here. There is nothing of value in this act. This amendment does not go far enough. The only amendment that would be appropriate would be an amendment that removed every single clause and every single portion of this bill. So speaking back to consultation, Mr. Chair, we saw clearly today that the chiefs from the Assembly of First Nations spoke very clearly about what they think about this bill. And let's be clear, Mr. Chair, the duty to consult is not a duty to appoint someone to maybe go and talk to a few people after you've already introduced the legislation. It is not a duty to say, we'll send someone over to explain that to you because you don't understand what we're talking about. It is not a duty to say, we'll pass the legislation, we'll put it in place, we'll put a little clause in saying, we promise to be nice to you, just trust us, and that's good enough. The duty to consult means that you sit down with dignity and respect with Indigenous leaders, with First Nations, and you talk to them about what you are thinking of doing or what you are intending to do. You genuinely listen to their feedback in a way that allows them to actually participate in the process before you attempt to move legislation that affects them. This government did none of those things because this government was in such a rush to bring in this flagship bill. It's clear that they barely even sat down and thought it through. They were so desperate to try to fulfill this radical promise of the Premier that she was going to give Alberta the power to never have to listen to anything the federal government ever said again. Taken from a cockeyed idea from Alberta separatists who intentionally wanted to pick a political fight, a constitutional fight, who said, yep, absolutely, this legislation is 100% unconstitutional, and that's the point. So the Premier had to try to find a way in a few short weeks to adapt that hot mess into this hot mess. into something that she could somehow get past all of the leadership candidates who now sit in her cabinet, who spoke out against the very concept and idea of this bill repeatedly on the record, talked about how destructive it would be for Alberta, how destructive it would be for our economy, the chaos it would cause. So what we have before us, Mr. Chair, is not a bill that's intended to do things better for Albertans. This is not a bill that is intended to improve our economy. It will not even improve things for our energy industry, Mr. Chair. It is here because it was a campaign promise for this Premier. It is about her political fortunes. It is about this government's intent to play political games in desperate hopes of re-election next May. And, you know, again, speaking of that consultation piece, Mr. Chair, as we look at this amendment, as this government tries to make a bad bill better and fails miserably because there is no redeeming it. One of the reasons that we have had so many challenges getting pipelines to Tidewater built is because conservative governments have done such a terrible job on the duty to consult. And the fact is that we saw this repeatedly under conservative federal governments. We saw that happen with Northern Gateway. It was killed because they tried to do a runaround on the duty to consult, to do it shorthand, find a shortcut, skip their homework, and they got called out by the courts. And you know what? Even the Liberal government, when they came in and were working on getting TMX through, even they had to go back and backtrack and make sure they did that consultation. Now, of course, they were having to work on a rather the poor foundation that had been laid before them. But the fact is, it still came down to the only reason that we have a pipeline to Tidewater that will be in operation next year is because the Liberal government sat down and redid that consultation. Our current mayor here in the city of Edmonton, actually, Mayor Amarjeet Sohi, in his role as the Minister of Natural Resources, sat down and redid that consultation and made sure it was done thoroughly and before the fact, and that got the approval to allow that pipeline to be built. Well, that, of course, in the advocacy of the Leader of the Official Opposition, the MLA for Edmonton Strathcona, who was relentless in holding the Prime Minister to account to ensure that pipeline was funded and built. And she did it, Mr. Chair, without a grandstanding hot mess of a piece of legislation that threatens to potentially scuttle any further energy infrastructure ever being built for the province of Alberta. So we have here this amendment today, which is removing some of the sweeping powers this government awarded itself. Again, that was certainly the largest concern that was raised, but it's not the only one. And multiple constitutional scholars have spoken out with concerns about it. Now, of course, this government has dug deep and spent days working to find the 1 in 10 dentists that will say that sugar does not cause cavities. They've managed to find a handful of those, but we know the vast majority of constitutional scholars, lawyers, individuals have spoken out and said, what we are saying, this bill is a hot mess. It's something that never should have seen the light of day in the legislature, and it's something that will cause untold headaches and costs for Albertans and potential damage to our economy. In the words of Ian Holloway, Dean of the Law School at the University of Calgary, if I was grading one of my first-year law students on the actual writing of the bill, I'd give them a C- at best. It's so poorly drafted, so riddled with internal contradictions, it's trying to thread a needle that's very hard to be threaded. To my mind, this is about as clearly an unconstitutional gambit as I have ever seen in my professional lifetime. The Premier is engaging in a game of political chicken. This is not really about asserting greater sovereignty for Alberta, but rather winning the election and goading the federal government into saying or doing something intemperate. And Mr. Chair, this is what this government makes its bill one. It's what it's obsessed with. It is what it's pouring all its energy into at a time when we have real problems here in the province of Alberta. A health care crisis. A health care crisis for children, Mr. Chair. On that, this Premier has next to nothing to say other than perhaps we'll get you some Tylenol in 4 to 6 weeks. But they have all the time in the world, all the power, all the resources to pour into this hot mess. This steaming wisdom pie. Even with removing the sweeping powers which the government awarded itself in this bill and then attempted to say was not in fact actually awarding itself and then said, well, maybe, and then said, oh, oops, sorry, we'll pull that out. Even without that, there are several legal problems that remain that make it very likely that this bill is utterly unconstitutional, including trying to award powers to the legislature which belong to the courts. Now, I find that incredibly presumptive, Mr. Chair. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a constitutional scholar. I do not believe I have the personal ability as an elected legislator to determine what is and is not constitutional. Neither does any member on that side of the House or this side of the House, even those that are lawyers, do not have that ability. Now, each of us may have an opinion. Certainly, we're all allowed to have one of those. You know what the saying is, everyone has an opinion. But that is far, far different, Mr. Chair, than saying our opinion should carry the weight of the rule of law. Now, of course, we as legislators are given enormous power to indeed introduce, debate, and to pass laws. And for that, there is no requirement, there is no IQ test, there is no experience requirement, because of course we want people of all experience, knowledge, skill sets to have the opportunity to represent the people of this province. But it is a far, far different thing, Mr. Chair, to say that anyone elected to this legislature has the skill, the knowledge to be able to determine at the same level as our Supreme Court what is constitutional, or that they should. Now, I get it. You can feel it can be really frustrating, really aggravating when someone else does something you don't like. It can be absolutely frustrating when you feel you do not have the power to retaliate, or that the means of, I guess, pushing back take time, take effort, that you can't have instant satisfaction. But that is simply the reality of life, Mr. Chair. That is what it means to be an adult. We have a system in place. If there is an issue of constitutionality, if we question whether or not something is constitutional, then we go to the courts. And the folks that are appointed to do that work, who have decades, in some cases, of experience, knowledge, training in making these, a group of them together will make that determination. What we have here is a government that is insisting they have the right to throw a temper tantrum when something happens they don't like. That because they don't like the time it would take to go through the courts. And let's be clear, Mr. Chair, this is a government that is happy to put that burden on other people. This is not a government that's been ashamed to trample on potentially labor rights and say, hey, if you don't like what we did, go to the court. In the meantime, we're going to do what we like.